Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'm going to be growing a Phalaenopsis Orchid over a rock inside a terrarium. So this is the terrarium I'm going to be using. It's a good size. It is maybe a little bit small for most orchids, but I've got a miniature Phalaenopsis Orchid which should fit in here quite nicely. Now the other thing I quite liked about this is that the whole top opens up, and the way it's built, it's a bit like a funnel, so it's very easy for me to get in there and actually access the inside and do any kind of work that I need to do in there. And also there is a very small piece of plastic at the bottom to seal the thing, so the whole thing's nicely sealed, which is always a bit of a concern when you've got terrariums if they're made out of metal. Often they leak quite easily or they can get corrosion, but this has got a nice plastic lining already in there, so I don't have to worry about any water that's going to possibly leak out in the future. So I'll start off by showing you the orchid I'm going to be using. So this is the orchid. Now it doesn't look too great at the moment, that's part of the reason this is the one I want to use. So I've had this one probably for about 6 or 7 years now. So about 5 years ago I repotted it. It was originally in sphagnum moss and it was suffering a bit. It has done really well for the last 4 years or so, but in the last year it's really started to struggle. Basically what's happened is it's getting pot bound. It's been in this pot for a long time. The growing medium's quite old, probably lost most of the structure and nutrition that it needs, and a lot of the new growth is starting to grow out of the actual container. So what I need to do with this is take it out of the old container and get it ready for growing on top of a rock. So the rock I'll be using, because in my area there's not really any porous rocks, it all tends to be granite or slate in my area, so what I'm using is an old piece of concrete. I've made sure it's quite a well-weathered piece of concrete. If it's quite fresh concrete, it can be very alkaline, and that's not going to be good for the roots. It could burn the roots. This one's quite weathered. It doesn't look too bad as well. I've cleaned it up slightly, but I don't want to scrub it too hard because I want it to be weathered concrete. If I scrub it too hard, it could expose some of the concrete from underneath, which could be quite alkaline. And also it looks slightly more like a rock when it's weathered. And the other reason is it's slightly dirty, so there's a lot more water carrying capacity with the dirt and also a bit more nutrients with the dirt. But I've gone for concrete because it's porous, so it can absorb the water. It's quite important that it grows on a porous substrate so that it can get the moisture it needs from that. So in the wild, Phalaenopsis orchids are actually epiphytic plants. What that means is it grows on trees, often in the crevices of trees, or even just straight on the bark on the outside of the trunk, and the roots kind of stick on. The roots have this special substance that it can produce that it helps stick to the surface, and they can grow their roots along several centimeters, sometimes a foot or more, along the trunk in all directions, and it will just cling on and hold to the tree like that. And then where it grows naturally, there's quite high rainfall, and whenever the rain washes down the trunk, it can get nutrients from any of the material that's been washed out through the rain, and also plenty of water. So it's good to have a slightly absorbent material, or slightly porous material, so it doesn't dry out too fast. But as it's inside this terrarium, it's not 100% essential that it's a porous material, as there will be high humidity. And I've gone with this terrarium because it's got a nice seal at the bottom, so I can keep that topped up with water, and the stone can naturally soak up a small amount of that water and allow the humidity to evaporate into the atmosphere as well, and keep it in a really nice humid environment. Now I'll just have to be careful that I don't disturb the roots too much. The roots are really what holds a lot of the energy and reserves for the plant. Most of it's in the leaves, but a lot of it's in the roots as well. So I'm just going to carefully take this out. Now I will have to remove a lot of the roots. Eventually all the roots that you see at the moment will be gone, and it will only have roots that are growing on the rock. But for now I want to limit the amount of root damage. So I'll try and take this out. I may have to cut some of them off though, because they might be too big and in the way. So you can tell there it's definitely quite an old plant. There's quite a lot of dead material, so I'll remove any of the dead material that is quite loose. Other bits I will have to cut off though. So as you can see there, a lot of the older roots underneath are actually dead. So I'll need to cut away all this dead material. I'm also going to take off these old flowering stems because they're not doing anything, and they could potentially become a risk for mold and fungus. So with most of the dead material gone, this is what I'm left with. So what I need to do now is start getting this ready for placing onto the stone. But before I go ahead with that, what I want to do is actually raise the level of this slightly up, because at the moment the stone goes quite deep into that little well where it holds the water, so you won't be able to see the roots at their best. So I want to raise this up slightly. What I'm going to use is just orchid mix. That will hold a bit of moisture for the orchid. It means it won't be exposed water, which could go green and have lots of algae if it's exposed to light. So that will keep the light away from it. And also, if the roots ever do go past the stone, and they can at least go into the substrate underneath, and that will give them an extra bit of growing space. So I'm just going to carefully put a thin layer on the bottom of orchid compost. This is just a bark based mix with a little bit of expanded clay as well. Sphagnum moss would probably also work, but I tend not to like sphagnum moss because it doesn't hold as much air as the orchid bark mix, and so I find that when the roots grow into it they can sometimes start to rot off over time. So I'm just going to check the level now, nestle the stone in, see if it's about the right height that I'm looking for. And I think that looks quite good. What I'm going for is a compromise between having it too buried and not being able to see the stone, also having it low enough that the plant has space to grow inside this terrarium. So the next stage is going to be a little bit tricky. What I basically need to do is attach this orchid onto the stone so it doesn't fall off and it stays still. If it stays still for long enough, what will happen is the old roots, they won't actually attach at all. They're finished growing. They might grow a little bit at the tips like this one here, but these won't attach to the stone. These new ones, however, they should be attracted to the moisture on the stone and the water, and they should start to grow into the stone and start to attach to it. So it's these new ones that are coming out. I really need to be careful not to damage. These old ones are not as important, but I want to just securely attach it to the top of the stone so the roots can then grow down and cover the surface. So I could use very thin bonsai wire, but I feel like that might cut into it a bit. So what I'm going to use is just a bit of garden twine, and then once the roots are established and the plant has stuck itself to the stone, I can remove this. And if I do ever forget to remove it, because it's garden twine, it should naturally biodegrade within a year or two. So that's it tied on. I've done it quite loosely so it doesn't damage the plant. I'm now ready to put it into the terrarium. What I will do is trim off some of these longest roots. Now if you're doing this yourself and you don't have a controlled environment that this is going into, this could actually kill the plant. As I say, it does store a lot of its nutrients and energy in the roots, and it's where it gets its water from. So if you are doing this, make sure you've got a controlled environment for it, or remove less of the roots. So the orchid is now ready to go into the terrarium. I'm just going to gently nestle it down in a position that I think looks quite nice. So that's it now in the terrarium. Now, despite being a miniature Phalaenopsis orchid and being actually one of the smallest Phalaenopsis orchid varieties I know of, this will still be a little bit big for this eventually. So what I might do is I might take this out and put it in a new, larger terrarium in the future. But certainly for the next year or so, this should do quite well for it. And if it does come into flower before I replant it, I will just lift the top off and enjoy the flowers coming out the top. Once it's well established on the rock and it's got its roots into the substrate, it shouldn't need a high humidity environment because it'll be able to get its water from the rocks. But for now I'll be keeping this closed to make sure it stays in a nice humid environment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go put this in a controlled environment. Basically I've got this area where I've got grow lights and a slightly heated area where I can keep it nice and warm, high humidity and good light conditions, and that should encourage it to grow well and put its roots over the stone. My controlled heated environment isn't probably essential, but I just wanted to give it the best head start I can because it has lost a lot of roots and it was already quite a poorly orchid that needed some attention anyway. So I'll see you guys in a few months' time. I'll see how it's done. So it's now actually over a year later. This project has taken a lot longer than I expected. Basically, there's a few reasons for this. First, the orchid was in really poor health, so it took quite a while to get itself established, get enough energy to then start flowering again. And secondly, with the European gas crisis at the moment, my house has been a lot colder than normal. Normally I'd have this under grow lights in winter to make it grow a bit better and have the house at quite a warm temperature, but I haven't been able to do that this year, so that's another reason why it's been a bit slower in its growth than I would have normally expected. But here it is. I haven't done any maintenance on it. All I've done is water it and occasional feed, but I haven't really fed it at all, as Phalaenopsis orchids don't need a lot of feed anyway. But I'll open it up now and show you what it looks like. As you can see, it is now in full bloom. It's looking quite nice. What it did is the first winter, it kind of sat there, didn't do much at all. I started filming this video back in December 2021. It's now February 2023. So what happened with this plant is over the winter of 2021 to 2022, so basically December to about March, it kind of sat there, didn't do much at all. I had it in a warm location with a few grow lights on it just to keep it ticking over because it's really too dark here in Scotland to just have it in natural daylight. Then over the summertime I put it on a windowsill that was away from direct sunlight but still had plenty of bright indirect light. It did quite well. it put out lots of new roots. You can see some here, like this one at the back. It started to come out and actually clung, is actually really solidly connected now to the back. So in Phalaenopsis orchids, what they do is that they're epiphytic plants, they grow on trees normally. The roots will come out and they actually stick to the tree, the bark of the tree, and that's basically what's happened here. I was hoping it would stick to the concrete that I had as a base, as I thought it would be porous enough, but it doesn't seem to have done that. I think the reasoning behind it is I actually had it too humid. So if I had it a bit drier in here and I had this open more, what the plant would have done, it would have tried harder to find the moisture and kept its roots closer and more compact to the concrete rock. But what it's done instead is just kind of sent them out in all directions because it's been humid enough, and that's why some of these, as you can see, have come straight out and connected with the side. Other ones have come straight down and they've rooted quite nicely now into the bark mix I have at the bottom, the orchid mix, but they haven't really stuck to the rock as intended, but I'm still quite happy with how it looks. As I say, I haven't done any maintenance on this at all. So as I say, for the first summer, the roots grew quite nicely, it put on lots of new leaves, and then coming into autumn and winter with a drop in temperature, that's triggered it into blooming. With Phalaenopsis orchids, they're actually subtropical plants, so they have a cooler season where they come from, and it's those cooler months where they actually start flowering. It's not very cold though, it's still around 20 degrees Celsius, but it's cooler than their summers, and that's what triggers blooming. In fact, if you want to upsize your orchid and have a giant plant, what you can do is keep them really warm for a couple of years at 30 degrees or so constantly. They'll grow loads of leaves, become a huge plant, and then when you suddenly drop the temperature down to about 20 degrees Celsius, you'll then get a huge flowering display because you've turbocharged the plant, got it really big, it's stored up loads of energy, and then can flower extra well. But anyway, this only had 1 year to grow, so it had a reasonable amount of growth, reasonable amount of flowers. As I say, this is a very small miniature Phalaenopsis orchid. It's never going to be huge, but this is probably pretty good for the size of the plant. It's got quite a lot of orchids, flowers on there. You can see the size of it compared with my hands. It is a very small orchid indeed. So all I need to do now is a bit of maintenance. As I say, it's been over a year, I haven't done any, so I've got some dead leaves to take out. We've also got some of the old roots which have died off. Most of the original roots that you saw in the first video have pretty much all died, and it's all the new roots which are alive. So I'm just going to go ahead, take any dead material off and remove those old dead roots. And you can see here, this is a good example of how the roots stick to things. This root is actually dead. The very top half here is probably alive, but this bottom half shriveled up and died. But you can see there the bark and the micro clay particles there. It's actually stuck on quite well, and that's what it does in the wild, as I say, as it climbs and it can grab onto rocks or the bark of trees. So that's the orchid now tidied up. I'm quite happy with how it looks. You can see it is growing on top of the rock, but unfortunately the roots aren't adhering to it as I would have liked. So what I might start doing now is leaving the top open more often. The reason I didn't do this before is because it was a really stressed plant. It didn't have a lot of roots, and the roots it did have weren't in any of the substrates, so it wasn't getting enough moisture. However, now we have got several roots down the bottom there, as you can see, which are growing right down into the orchid mix. So if I leave this open, it won't dry out too much because it can send up the moisture from the growing medium with the roots that are in there. But what it means is if I have this open, the newer roots are more likely to try and adhere to the rock if it's kept nice and damp, as they'll be looking for the moisture. So that's about it for this video. I'm quite happy with how it's done. It has taken a lot longer than expected, but I'm quite happy with the results. I would like, as I say, the roots to adhere a bit better in the future. Hopefully a bit of tweaking, we were leaving this open a bit more and making sure that I water the rock more regularly to keep it wet. We might get some adhering of the roots to the rock next time. And also with having the roof open more, it'll give more space for this flower shoot to come up. This flower shoot won't grow much more. As you can see, it's just coming to the end of its flowering. But the next shoot that comes up will hopefully come up a bit higher. Because this has been held down by the lid there, it hasn't grown very tall. But with the next flower shoot that it grows, I'll have the lid up. We'll hopefully get a taller flower, be more obvious, easier to see. This one's a bit kind of hunkered down, but generally quite happy with how it's done, and I'll give you guys updates in the future when this comes into flowering. It'll probably be another year or two, because what I want to try and do is try and get this sized up a bit more, get the roots more established before I then give it some colder temperatures and induce flowering.